The rancher's reckoning. The woman standing on Caleb Rowe's porch didn't look like salvation. She looked like the ghost of every mistake he'd ever made. Her dress was threadbare, her children half frozen in the Montana wind, and when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of desperation that men like Caleb had spent years learning to ignore. "They aren't yours," May Sullivan said, her breath forming clouds in the bitter air. "But they need you." Behind her, a boy of maybe 8 clutched his sister's hand so tight their knuckles had gone white. Caleb's jaw tightened. He'd built this silence, earned it with blood and distance, and now this stranger wanted to shatter it with someone else's burden. He started to close the door. Then the girl whimpered, just once, and something ancient and unwanted stirred in his chest. Welcome to a story of survival, redemption, and the families we choose when blood fails us. If you're watching from anywhere in the world, drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this tale travels. Now settle in, because this journey starts with a closed door and ends with one that finally opens. The wind that November evening didn't just blow, it cut. It came screaming down from the Bitterroot Range with the kind of cold that made bones ache and sensible people question their life choices. Caleb Rowe stood at his kitchen window, coffee growing cold in his scarred hands, watching the last light bleed out of the sky. The ranch stretched before him in shades of gray and shadow, 200 acres of hard-won solitude that asked nothing of him except the work. That's how he preferred it. The cattle were bedded down, the horses fed. The fence line he'd ridden that morning was solid for another season. Everything in its place, everything predictable. Caleb had built this life deliberately, brick by brick, silence by silence, until the only voice he heard most days was his own, and he'd learned to keep even that one quiet. Then came the knock. It was so soft he almost missed it beneath the wind's howl. 3 hesitant taps that didn't belong to the rhythm of his evening, didn't fit the pattern of his carefully constructed isolation. Caleb set down his cup slowly, his body going still the way it always did when something unexpected entered his world. Nobody came out here. Not anymore. He crossed the main room in 4 strides, his boots heavy on the planked floor. Through the frosted glass panel of the door, he could make out shapes, human shapes, small ones. His hand found the rifle he kept mounted beside the frame, more habit than necessity, and he pulled the door open just wide enough to see. The woman was the first thing his eyes caught, mid-20s, maybe 30 at most, with dark hair coming loose from a braid and eyes that held the particular kind of tired that comes from running too long with nowhere safe to land. Her dress was wool, decent quality once, but worn thin at the shoulders and hem. No coat. In this cold, no coat meant either stupidity or desperation, and the way she stood, protective, defensive, ready to bolt, told him which. Behind her, pressed close, were the children. The boy was all sharp angles and watchful eyes, maybe 8 years old, his jaw set in that particular way boys learn when they've had to grow up faster than childhood allows. He wore a man's coat cut down to size, the sleeves still too long, and his hand gripped his sister's with white-knuckled intensity. The girl couldn't have been more than 5. She was barely visible behind her brother's shoulder, her face half hidden in a knitted scarf that had seen better years. But Caleb could see her eyes. Wide, dark, and filled with the kind of fear that children shouldn't know. "Help you?" Caleb's voice came out rougher than he'd intended, unused to conversation, unwilling to soften. The woman straightened her spine, lifted her chin. "My name is May Sullivan. These are my children, Thomas and Lucy. We've been traveling for 3 days. We need shelter, just for the night. Town's 5 miles east." Caleb started to close the door. "Please." The word stopped him, not because it was loud, but because it wasn't. May Sullivan didn't raise her voice, didn't beg or plead or perform desperation. She simply stated fact. They can't make another 5 miles tonight, not in this cold. Caleb looked past her to where the prairie stretched endlessly dark. No wagon, no horses, no supplies he could see. They'd walked here, in November, in Montana, either running from something or running toward it, and neither option was his concern. "There's a line shack about 2 miles south," he said. "Stoveworks, wood stacked. You can make it there." "We tried. The roof's collapsed." He knew that. Had known it since the spring thaw when he'd ridden past and made a mental note to fix it before winter. A note he'd ignored because he had no use for a line shack when he worked his land alone. Not my problem. May's expression didn't change. No, it's not. But they're cold, Mr. Rowe, and they're children. And I'm asking. The use of his name should have alarmed him, should have sent every warning bell in his head clanging, but he was too focused on what she'd said. They're children. As if that was supposed to mean something to him, as if the fact of their existence created some kind of obligation in his world. How'd you know my name? Your brother told me about you, years ago. Said you had a ranch in Montana, that you were... She stopped, choosing words carefully. That you were good, once. The mention of his brother hit like a fist to the gut. Caleb's hand tightened on the doorframe, his knuckles going white. He hadn't heard Matthew's name spoken aloud in 7 years, hadn't allowed himself to think it in almost as long. My brother's dead. I know. I was there when he died. The world tilted slightly. Caleb stared at this woman, this stranger who somehow knew the one thing he'd spent years trying to forget, and felt something crack in the careful walls he'd built around himself. Behind her, the little girl began to cry, soft, desperate sounds muffled by her scarf, and the boy pulled her closer, whispering something Caleb couldn't hear. One night, Caleb heard himself say, "Barn's warm. There's hay. You can sleep there." "Thank you." "Don't." He cut her off. "Don't thank me. And don't expect more than you're getting." He stepped back and closed the door before she could respond, before he could see the relief or gratitude or whatever emotion might cross her face. Through the window, he watched them make their way toward the barn, the boy half carrying his sister, May walking behind them with her shoulders squared against the cold and the world. Caleb stood there until they disappeared into the darkness, then returned to his cold coffee and tried to convince himself he'd done enough. Sleep didn't come easy that night. Caleb lay in his bed listening to the wind test the windows and thinking about 3 people sleeping in his barn. Thinking about Matthew. Thinking about all the ways silence could be broken and all the reasons he'd built it in the first place. When dawn finally came, gray and cold and unforgiving, he dressed quickly and headed outside to do his morning work. The cattle needed checking, the horses needed feeding, and if he timed it right, the woman and her children would be gone before he had to face them again. Except they weren't gone. They were sitting on the porch steps. May had her arms wrapped around both children, all 3 of them huddled together for warmth. And when Caleb approached, she didn't stand, didn't apologize, didn't offer excuses. She just looked at him with those tired, determined eyes and waited. "You need to move on," Caleb said. "Where?" "Not my concern." "No, it's not." May shifted, revealing Lucy's face. The girl's lips had a blue tinge, her breathing shallow. "But she's sick. Has been since yesterday. I was hoping the barn would be warm enough, but..." Her voice caught, just slightly. "I can't take her back out in the cold. Not yet." Caleb looked at the child, really looked. The fever flush on her cheeks, the glassy quality of her eyes, the way she leaned too heavily against her mother. Pneumonia, maybe, or something close to it. The kind of thing that killed children out here, in the cold, far from doctors and medicine. "There's a doctor in town," he said. "I don't have money for a doctor." May said it simply, without shame. "I don't have money for much of anything." "Then you shouldn't be out here." "You're right, we shouldn't, but we are." She pulled Lucy closer. "I'm not asking for charity, Mr. Rowe. I can work. I can cook, clean, mend. Thomas can help with livestock. We'll earn our keep, just until she's well enough to travel. I don't need help." "Everyone needs help." "I don't." Thomas spoke for the first time, his voice quiet but steady. "Please, mister, Lucy's real sick. Mama's trying not to show it, but I can tell. We won't be trouble. I promise." The boy's eyes were too old for his face, filled with the kind of responsibility that comes from being the man of a family before you've learned to shave. Caleb recognized that look. Had worn it himself once, a lifetime ago. He looked at the 3 of them, this broken, desperate family on his porch, and felt the weight of a choice he didn't want to make. Every instinct told him to send them away, to protect his solitude, to maintain the careful distance that kept him safe from caring about anything he could lose. But the girl was sick, and the boy was trying so damn hard to be brave. And the woman who knew his brother was looking at him like he might still be the good man Matthew had apparently believed he was. 3 days, Caleb said finally, until she's well. Then you leave. Relief washed over May's face, but she schooled it quickly. 3 days. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. Caleb opened the door. And don't make me regret this. The house hadn't held more than one person in 7 years, and it showed. Caleb watched May's eyes take in the sparse furniture, the dust on surfaces, the absolute lack of anything that suggested comfort or welcome. The main room served as kitchen and living area, with a fireplace that provided most of the heat. 2 bedrooms branched off to the side, his and the one that had been Matthew's. That door hadn't been opened in 7 years either. You can have the spare room, Caleb said, nodding toward Matthew's old door. It's small, but there's a bed. I'll get the fire going. May carried Lucy inside while Thomas hesitated at the threshold, looking up at Caleb with uncertain eyes. The boy was taking his measure, trying to determine if this man was safety or just another kind of threat. You can come in, Caleb said. Won't bite. Thomas stepped inside carefully, like he was entering a church or a tomb. He kept close to the wall, his eyes tracking Caleb's every movement, and Caleb recognized that wariness too. The boy had learned not to trust. Smart kid. While May got Lucy settled in the spare room, Caleb built up the fire and put coffee on to boil. The familiar motions gave him something to do with his hands, something to focus on besides the way his house suddenly felt too small and too full all at once. She's sleeping, May said, emerging from the bedroom and closing the door quietly behind her. The warmth is already helping. Caleb grunted acknowledgement and poured coffee into 2 cups. He slid one across the table toward May, who took it with both hands, warming them on the ceramic. Your brother, she said after a moment. He talked about you a lot. Said you 2 used to work a ranch together down in Wyoming. Long time ago. He said you were the best rancher he ever knew. Said you could read weather like some men read books, and that you never lost a calf to wolves because you always knew where they'd strike. Caleb's jaw tightened. He didn't want to talk about Matthew, didn't want to hear what his brother had said or thought or believed, because all of that belonged to a version of himself that no longer existed. He also said you saved his life once, May continued quietly. During a blizzard, you went out looking for him when everyone else said he was already dead. Didn't save him in the end. The words came out harsher than he'd intended, sharp enough to cut. May flinched slightly but didn't back down. No, you didn't, but that wasn't your fault. You don't know what you're talking about. Don't I? May set down her cup. Matthew died in a mining accident. Cave-in. I was working at the boarding house where he stayed. I was there when they brought his body back. She paused. I was also there when he asked me to find you if anything ever happened to him. Caleb stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. He asked you to find me? He said if he died, I should bring his children to you. Said you'd take care of them. The bottom dropped out of Caleb's world. He stared at May, at this woman who'd shown up on his doorstep in the middle of winter, and suddenly everything made a terrible kind of sense. They're Matthew's. It wasn't a question. May nodded slowly. Thomas and Lucy are your brother's children, Mr. Rowe, and I'm their mother. But the silence that followed was absolute. Caleb stood frozen by the table, his mind racing through calculations, through memories, through the simple math of what May was telling him. Matthew had children. Matthew had a wife. Matthew had built a life after they'd parted ways, and Caleb had known nothing about it. You were married to my brother. No. May shook her head. We were never married. Matthew and we had an arrangement. I needed help with the children. He needed someone to make his boarding house feel like home. It wasn't love, Mr. Rowe. It was survival. But they're his. Thomas's. Lucy. May hesitated. Lucy is from before. Different father. But Matthew raised her like she was his. He loved them both. Loved them enough to make me promise I'd bring them here if anything happened. Caleb finally moved, pacing to the window and back, trying to process what he was hearing. Why now? Matthew died, 2 years ago? 3. I tried to make it work on my own. Took in laundry, worked at the general store, did whatever I could to keep us fed. But the town, she stopped, choosing words carefully. There were men who thought a woman alone with children was available. One of them got insistent, violent, so we left. You could have gone anywhere. I could have, but I promised Matthew, and despite everything, he believed you were a good man. He believed you'd help. Caleb laughed, a short, bitter sound. Then he didn't know me as well as he thought. Maybe. Or maybe he knew you better than you know yourself. Thomas appeared in the doorway then, his eyes moving between his mother and Caleb with concern. Is everything okay, Mama? May's expression softened instantly. Everything's fine, sweetheart. Mr. Rowe was just... She looked at Caleb, waiting. He could end this now. Could tell her that Matthew had been wrong, that he wasn't the man his brother remembered, that they needed to leave as soon as the girl was well enough to travel. It would be easy, clean, a return to the silence he'd worked so hard to build. But Thomas was looking at him with Matthew's eyes. The same gray-blue, the same intensity, the same hope that the world might still contain good people who did good things. I was just saying, Caleb heard himself continue, that 3 days might not be enough. Not if Lucy's as sick as she looks. Relief flooded May's face. Thank you. Week, maybe, until she's strong enough for travel. After that, we'll figure something out. It wasn't a promise. It wasn't even close to acceptance. But it was more than he'd intended to give, and from the way May's shoulders relaxed, it was enough. I'll earn our keep, she said firmly. Whatever you need. What I need, Caleb interrupted, is for everyone to stay out of my way while I work. You want to help? Fine. But don't expect conversation. Don't expect... He struggled for the word. Don't expect anything except a roof and heat. Clear? May nodded. Clear. Good. Caleb grabbed his coat and hat. I've got work to do. There's food in the pantry. Help yourself. He was out the door before either of them could respond, desperate for air, for space, for the familiar rhythm of work that didn't require him to feel anything except the burn of muscles and the bite of cold. Behind him, the house held 3 people who were slowly, inexorably, cracking the foundations of his carefully built isolation. And Caleb had no idea how to stop it. The days developed a rhythm despite Caleb's resistance. He rose before dawn, dressed in the dark, and tried to slip out without waking anyone. But by the second morning, May was already up, coffee brewing, offering him a cup with quiet efficiency. He took it without comment and left without thanks, but the pattern held. Thomas shadowed him like a ghost. The boy would appear at the barn while Caleb was feeding horses, standing just inside the doorway, silent and watchful. Caleb ignored him at first, focusing on his work, on the familiar tasks that required nothing of him except competence. But the kid was persistent. By the 3rd day, Thomas had started helping without being asked, forking hay to the horses, filling water troughs, carrying tools. His movements were careful, almost reverent, as if he understood the privilege of being allowed in Caleb's space and didn't want to waste it. Your mama teach you to work stock? Caleb finally asked, watching the boy measure out grain with surprising precision. No, sir. Uncle Matthew did. Before he... Thomas's voice caught. Before. Uncle Matthew. The title hit Caleb sideways, a reminder that Matthew had lived, had been present, had taught this boy things Caleb should have been there to teach. He pushed the thought away and focused on the work. He teach you about weight distribution? Thomas looked up, uncertain. Sir? When you're loading grain, you're measuring by eye, but horses need it measured by weight. Different feeds have different densities. See? Caleb demonstrated, showing the boy how to feel the heft of the scoop, how to adjust based on the feed type. The kid absorbed it like water in drought, his eyes tracking every movement, his hands imitating Caleb's technique with remarkable accuracy. Smart boy, quick learner. Matthew would have been proud. Thank you, sir, Thomas said when they finished, for teaching me. It's just feeding horses. It's more than that. The boy looked up at him with those eyes that were too old, too knowing. You're treating me like I'm worth teaching. That's something. Caleb turned away, uncomfortable with the gratitude, with the weight of what the boy wasn't saying. How many men had treated Thomas like he was worthless? How many times had this kid been told he didn't matter? Go check on your sister, Caleb said gruffly. Your mama probably needs help. Thomas left without argument, but Caleb could feel the impression of him lingering like a handprint on glass. The boy was getting under his skin, finding cracks in his armor, and Caleb didn't know how to seal them back up. Inside the house, changes were happening whether Caleb wanted them or not. May moved through his space with quiet efficiency, cleaning without rearranging, cooking without claiming territory. She seemed to understand intuitively that this was still his domain, that she was guest and interloper, and she walked that line with careful grace. But the house was different. Cleaner, yes. The windows had been washed, the floors swept, the accumulated dust of years removed with patient labor. But it was more than cleanliness. There was a smell now, cooking bread, herb tea, the particular scent of children and care and life being actively lived. Lucy improved slowly. By the fourth day she was sitting up, her fever broken, her color returning. She was a quiet child, watchful like her brother, but softer somehow, less hardened by whatever they'd endured. She'd started leaving small drawings around the house, rough sketches done in charcoal on scraps of paper May had found. Little pictures of horses and birds and houses with smoke curling from chimneys. Caleb found one on the kitchen table one morning. It showed a man, tall and lean, standing next to a horse. At the bottom, in careful letters, someone had written, Mr. Caleb. He stared at it for longer than he'd intended, then carefully folded it and put it in his pocket. At dinner that evening, because May had somehow made dinner a thing that happened, a gathering rather than fuel consumed in solitude, Lucy smiled at him. Just a small thing, a quick flash before she ducked her head back to her soup. But Caleb felt it like sunshine breaking through storm clouds. She likes you, May said quietly after the children had gone to bed. They were sitting at the table, May mending a shirt by lamplight, Caleb ostensibly reading the same page of livestock reports he'd been staring at for 20 minutes. She doesn't know me. Maybe that's why she likes you. No history to overcome. Caleb set down his papers. How long were you with Matthew? May's hand stilled on her mending. About a year. He came through town, took a room at the boarding house where I worked. We got to talking. He was kind. That was... She smiled sadly. That was rare. He was always kind, even when he shouldn't have been. Is that why you two stopped talking? The question was gentle but direct, and Caleb found himself answering despite his better judgment. We had a ranch together, down in Wyoming, like you said. Partnership was supposed to be equal, but Matthew, he was generous to a fault. Started lending money to neighbors, making deals that cost more than they brought in. We nearly lost everything. So you left. I told him he had to choose the ranch or his charity. He chose the people who needed help, so I left. Caleb's voice was flat, reciting facts. Came up here, started over. Last I heard from him was a letter saying he'd sold his half and moved to the mining camps. That was 7 years ago. May resumed her mending, her needle moving with practiced rhythm. He never stopped talking about you. Even at the end, he'd tell Thomas stories. The brother who could track a mountain lion through rock, who once punched a bear for getting too close to the cattle. I didn't punch a bear. Shot near it? Maybe. A smile tugged at May's mouth. He made you sound like a legend. Thomas has been terrified of disappointing you. Caleb looked toward the closed bedroom door where the children slept. Kid's got nothing to be afraid of. Doesn't he? You're the only family he has left who shares his blood. What you think of him matters. I'm not family. You're his uncle, whether you claim it or not. The word sat heavy in the air between them. Uncle. A title that implied relationship, responsibility, connection. Everything Caleb had spent years avoiding. Week's almost up, he said, instead of addressing it. Lucy's better. You should start thinking about where you'll go. May set down her mending and looked at him directly. I have been thinking about it, and I don't have an answer. The towns between here and anywhere safe, they all have men who might recognize us, might follow. Coming here, to the middle of nowhere, to a man who doesn't want company, that was the safest option I could think of. You can't stay here forever. I'm not asking for forever. I'm asking for... She struggled for words. I'm asking for long enough to figure out what comes next. Long enough for Thomas to learn what a good man looks like. Long enough for Lucy to remember what safety feels like. I'm not a good man. You took us in. You're teaching my son. You carried Lucy to bed last night when she fell asleep at the table. Yes, I saw. May leaned forward. You're trying very hard to pretend you don't care, Mr. Rowe, but you're not very good at it. Caleb stood abruptly. I'm going to check the stock. It was full dark, the check was unnecessary, and they both knew it. But May didn't call him on the excuse. She just watched him grab his coat and disappear into the night, seeking the cold and darkness where emotions could freeze before they became dangerous. The week passed, then another day, then 2 more. Caleb stopped mentioning departure. May stopped asking about timelines. The arrangement simply continued, unspoken and undefined, while winter deepened around them and the house slowly came back to life. Thomas grew bolder in his questions, asking about ranching techniques, about weather patterns, about the scars Caleb carried on his hands from years of hard work. The boy soaked up knowledge like he'd been starving for it, and Caleb found himself teaching more than he'd intended, sharing more than was wise. Lucy started venturing out to the barn, wrapped in blankets, watching them work. She didn't talk much, but she'd started sitting on the fence rail while Caleb worked the horses, her small face serious with concentration. One morning she brought him a drawing, a man on horseback against mountains, and when he took it without comment but carefully placed it in his pocket with the others, her smile could have lit the whole prairie. May made the house function. Meals appeared on schedule, clothes got mended. The pantry, which had held bachelor basics, now boasted preserves and dried herbs, and the kind of thoughtful organization that spoke of a woman who knew how to make much from little. She did it all without claiming credit, without demanding acknowledgement, just quiet competence that made Caleb's life easier whether he admitted it or not. And slowly, so slowly he almost didn't notice, the silence Caleb had built his life around began to feel less like protection and more like prison. He started staying in after dinner instead of retreating to the barn, started listening when Thomas talked about the book May was teaching him to read, started noticing when Lucy would fall asleep with her head against his chair, trusting enough to be vulnerable in his presence. It was dangerous, all of it. Every moment of connection was a thread being woven, binding him to people he'd have to let go eventually, because they couldn't stay, because he couldn't be what they needed, because opening himself to care was opening himself to loss, and he'd had enough loss for one lifetime. But on the 13th night of their stay, when Lucy woke screaming from a nightmare and Caleb found himself standing in the doorway watching May comfort her, something shifted. He saw himself from the outside, this man who'd built walls so high he couldn't see over them anymore, who'd made loneliness into armor and isolation into identity. And he wondered, just for a moment, if Matthew had been right about him after all. If somewhere under the scar tissue and silence, the good man still existed, waiting for someone brave enough to find him. Jasang. Morning came cold and clear, the kind of winter day that turned the world into crystal. Caleb was in the barn checking a mare's hoof when Thomas appeared, his breath visible in the frozen air, his expression troubled. Mr. Rowe? There's someone coming. Caleb straightened immediately, his body going still in that way it always did when threat approached. How many? 3 riders, still far off, but heading this way. Caleb moved to the barn door and looked out toward the horizon. Sure enough, 3 dark shapes moved across the white landscape, still distant but closing steadily. Riders in winter, out here where there was nothing but his ranch for miles, meant either lost travelers or deliberate seekers. And nobody sought him out for good reasons. Get inside, Caleb said. Tell your mother to keep Lucy quiet and away from windows. But see, now Thomas. The boy ran. Caleb watched him go, then returned to the barn and retrieved the rifle he kept wrapped in oilcloth in the tack room. He checked the load, made sure the action was smooth, then positioned himself just inside the barn door where he had a clear sight line to the house and the approaching riders. The wait felt eternal. He watched the 3 shapes resolve into men on horseback, watched them approach at an unhurried pace that suggested confidence more than caution. They knew where they were going, knew what they were looking for. Or who. When they were close enough to make out details, Caleb's grip on the rifle tightened. The man in the center was big, heavy-shouldered, with the kind of face that suggested violence came easy and often. The two flanking him were younger, harder, their hands resting casually near sidearms that looked well used. The big man raised a hand in greeting as they approached, his smile not reaching his eyes. "Morning, friend," he called out. "Cold one, isn't it?" Caleb stepped into view, rifle held low but ready. "Can I help you?" "Maybe. We're looking for someone. Woman traveling with 2 children, dark-haired, pretty, in a tired sort of way. You seen anyone like that?" "Just me out here." The man's smile widened. "That right? Because we tracked them this direction, and your ranch is the only thing for miles." He leaned forward in his saddle. "See, the woman, May, her name is, she has something that belongs to my employer, something valuable. We just want to talk to her about returning it. Don't know anyone by that name." "I think you're lying, friend." The big man's hand moved toward his gun. "And I think you should reconsider before this gets unpleasant." Inside the house, Caleb saw movement at the window. May's face, pale and terrified, before Thomas pulled her back. They knew these men, feared them. And from the way the riders sat their horses, weapons ready, violence hovering just beneath the surface, that fear was justified. Caleb had a choice to make. The smart choice was to step aside. Let them take May and the children, let them ride away and return his life to the blessed silence he'd been maintaining for 7 years. It wasn't his fight. They weren't his responsibility. He owed them nothing except 3 weeks of shelter, and that debt was long paid. But Thomas had Matthew's eyes. Lucy had started to smile at him. May had called him a good man, and maybe, just maybe, there was still enough of that man left to matter. "You need to leave," Caleb said quietly. "Now." The big man's smile finally died. "That's how you want to play this?" "That's how it is. 3 of us, friend. 1 of you. You might get 1, maybe 2, if you're fast, but the 3rd will kill you. Is she worth dying for?" Caleb thought about Matthew, about promises made and broken, about the way silence could be both sanctuary and cage. He thought about a boy learning to measure horse feed, and a girl who drew pictures of safety, and a woman who'd walked 3 days through winter to find a good man who might not exist anymore. He thought about all the ways a life could narrow until you forgot what it felt like to stand for something. "Guess we'll find out," Caleb said, and raised his rifle. The world exploded into motion and gunfire, and the silence Caleb had built his life around shattered like glass. The first shot came from the rider on the left, a crack that split the frozen air and sent splinters flying from the barn door frame 6 inches from Caleb's head. He didn't flinch. 7 years of isolation hadn't dulled the instincts forged in harder times, and his return fire was immediate and precise. The young rider jerked backward in his saddle, his gun falling from suddenly nerveless fingers as he clutched his shoulder and screamed. The big man's horse reared, dancing sideways as its rider fought for control and drew his own weapon. Caleb was already moving, using the barn's corner for cover as the 3rd rider opened fire, bullets punching into weathered wood with dull thunks that sent his old war dog into a frenzy of barking somewhere deeper in the barn. "Last chance," Caleb called out, ejecting his spent casing and loading another round with hands that remembered this dance, even if his heart had tried to forget it. "Take your man and ride out." The big man's answer was another shot that whined past Caleb's ear close enough to feel the heat. "That woman owes a debt. We're not leaving without her." "Then you're not leaving." Caleb fired again, aiming for the big man's horse this time, and the animal bolted with a scream of equine terror, carrying its cursing rider 20 yards before he could regain control. The 3rd rider used the distraction to charge forward, gun blazing, and Caleb felt something hot tear across his ribs as he dove behind a water trough. The impact drove the breath from his lungs, but his hand stayed steady, his aim true. And when he rose over the trough's rim, the charging rider was clutching his leg and sawing at his reins, trying to turn his panicking mount. Inside the house, Caleb heard Thomas shouting something, heard May's voice raised in fear or warning, but he couldn't spare attention for anything except the big man who dismounted and was advancing on foot now, using his spooked horse as mobile cover. This one was a fighter, experienced enough to know that mounted men made easy targets and smart enough to adapt when the first plan failed. "You're protecting a thief," the big man called out, still moving, still closing the distance between them. "She stole from Cyrus Blackwell. You know that name?" Caleb did. Everyone in Montana knew Blackwell's name, a businessman who'd built his fortune on mining claims and maintained it through methods that existed in the gray space between legal and lethal. Men who crossed Blackwell tended to disappear or wish they had, and the law looked the other way because Blackwell owned enough of it to make looking profitable. "Don't care whose name she stole from," Caleb replied, tracking the big man's movement, waiting for a clear shot. "She's under my roof now. Noble, stupid, but noble." The big man laughed, harsh and humorless. "Blackwell doesn't forget debts, friend. You make this your fight, it stays your fight. He'll send more men, better men. This doesn't end today." "Then it doesn't end today." Caleb saw the moment of decision in the big man's eyes, saw him commit to the rush that would bring them into close quarters where rifles became clumsy and knives or fists would decide outcomes. He was already bracing for it when the house door slammed open and Thomas appeared on the porch, holding Caleb's old Spencer carbine like his life depended on it. "Leave him alone," the boy shouted, his voice cracking with fear and determination. The carbine wavered in his grip, but stayed pointed in the big man's general direction. "You leave him alone or I'll shoot." "Thomas, get back inside," Caleb yelled, but the distraction had already cost him. The big man lunged, using Thomas's appearance to cover his final approach, and suddenly they were too close for rifles, too tangled for clean shots. Caleb felt the impact as the big man's shoulder drove into his chest, felt them both go down into the snow in a sprawl of limbs and violence. The rifle spun away. Caleb's head cracked against frozen ground hard enough to make stars burst across his vision, and then the big man's fist was connecting with his jaw, his ribs, anywhere he could reach. Caleb twisted, threw an elbow that caught the man's throat and bought him a second to breathe, to think, to remember that he'd fought hand-to-hand before and survived. They rolled, grappling for advantage, breath coming in frozen gasps. The big man was heavy, strong, but Caleb was desperate, and desperate men fought dirty. He got a thumb in close to the man's eye, felt him rear back, and used the space to drive a knee into the soft place below the ribs that made any man's body forget how to breathe. The big man fell away, choking, and Caleb scrambled for his rifle only to find Thomas standing over it, the carbine still raised, tears streaming down the boy's face but his hand steady enough. "Don't," Thomas said to the big man, who was struggling to his knees. "Don't make me." The tableau held for a heartbeat, Caleb bleeding in the snow, the big man gasping for air, Thomas standing between them with a gun he barely knew how to use and a courage that made Caleb's chest ache. The two other riders had retreated to a safe distance, one still bleeding from his shoulder, the other clutching his leg, neither willing to press the fight further. The big man looked at Thomas, at Caleb, at the house where May's face was visible in the window. Then he spat blood into the snow and laughed. "You got sand, kid. I'll give you that." He climbed slowly to his feet, hands raised in surrender. "But this isn't over. Blackwell wants what's his, and Blackwell gets what he wants. You remember that when more men come, when they come at night, when they burn you out or worse." "Let them come," Caleb said, retrieving his rifle and keeping it trained on the big man as he backed toward his horse. "I'll be here. Your funeral, friend." The three riders left slowly, the wounded men swaying in their saddles, the big man looking back once with a promise in his eyes that was clearer than words. When they finally disappeared over the far ridge, Caleb let out a breath he hadn't known he was holding and turned to find Thomas still standing there, the carbine now hanging loose in his hands, his whole body beginning to shake with reaction. "I thought they were going to kill you," the boy whispered. Caleb took the carbine gently from his grip. "They tried. I couldn't let them. I couldn't—" Thomas's voice broke and suddenly he was crying, huge gulping sobs that shook his thin frame. Caleb stood there awkwardly, unsure what to do with a crying child. With gratitude he didn't know how to express, with the weight of what this boy had just risked for him. Then instinct older than thought took over, and he pulled Thomas against his chest, let the boy sob into his coat, while he looked over his head at the house where May stood on the porch now, her face pale, her eyes wide with horror at what she'd brought to his doorstep. "It's okay," Caleb heard himself say, one hand coming up to rest on Thomas's head. "You're okay. We're all okay." It was a lie. They all knew it was a lie, but sometimes lies were all you had to build hope on. May reached them as Thomas's sobs began to quiet, her hands fluttering over both of them, checking for injuries, for blood, for damage that might not show yet. The wound across Caleb's ribs was bleeding through his shirt, but it was shallow, the kind of thing that would hurt for weeks but kill nothing except pride. The bruises from the fight would bloom spectacular by morning. "Inside," May said, her voice shaking. "Both of you. Now." They didn't argue. The adrenaline was fading and cold was setting in, the kind that came from shock as much as temperature. Caleb let May steer them both into the house where Lucy waited by the fire, her eyes huge in her small face, her arms wrapped around herself like she was trying to hold her own pieces together. "Are they gone?" she asked in a tiny voice. "For now," Caleb said, because he wouldn't lie to her about this. "But they'll be back." May pushed him into a chair and started pulling his shirt away from the wound with hands that trembled despite her attempts at steadiness. "This needs cleaning. Thomas, get me hot water and clean cloth. Lucy, honey, stay by the fire." Both children moved to obey, grateful for tasks that gave them purpose. Caleb sat still while May worked, feeling the sting of whiskey on torn skin, feeling her fingers probe gently for damage deeper than surface. She was close enough that he could smell the fear on her, the guilt, the terror of what she'd almost lost. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I should have told you, should have explained what we were running from. This is my fault." "Who's Blackwell to you?" May's hand stilled on the bandage she was wrapping. "I worked for his wife, not him, his wife. She was kind, treated me like family. When she died last year, she left me some money in her will. Not much, just a few $100s. But Blackwell, he said it belonged to him, that she had no right to give it away. He demanded I return it. Did you?" "Most of it. I used some to bury her proper, some to feed my children that winter. But he wanted all of it, every penny, and when I couldn't give it—" She stopped, her voice catching. "He said I'd work it off, in his saloon. You understand what that means?" Caleb understood. The kind of work Blackwell would demand wouldn't be served drinks and swept floors. "So you ran." "I ran, took the children and every dollar I had left and ran. I thought—" May laughed bitterly. "I thought Montana was big enough to get lost in. I was wrong. How much do you still owe him?" $80. In his accounting, with interest, probably closer to $200 by now. But it's not about the money. It never was. She finished the bandage and sat back, meeting his eyes. "It's about control, about making an example, about showing that nobody walks away from Cyrus Blackwell without consequences." Thomas appeared with the hot water, his face still blotchy from crying, but his jaw set with determination. "We can leave. Tonight. Before they come back. We can—" "No," Caleb said. "But they'll kill you. That man said they'd come back with more. I know what he said." Caleb stood slowly, testing his ribs, feeling the pull of damaged muscle. "And running won't change anything. Blackwell's men will chase you until they catch you, or you're so far gone nothing matters anymore. That's not living, that's just slow dying." May shook her head. "We can't ask you to fight our battles." "You're not asking, I'm choosing." He looked at her, at Thomas, at Lucy, who watched from the fireplace with solemn eyes. "They came to my ranch, threatened people under my roof, made it my fight the moment they rode onto my land. One man against Blackwell's whole operation? That's suicide. Maybe. But I've been dead in every way that matters for 7 years. Might as well die for something that counts." The words hung in the air, stark and honest. May stared at him like she was seeing him for the first time, really seeing him, and what she found there made her eyes shine with tears she refused to let fall. "Matthew was right about you," she said softly. "Matthew was wrong about a lot of things. Not this. Never this." Thomas moved closer, standing beside Caleb with a posture that declared allegiance clearer than words. "What do we do?" Caleb looked at the boy, at his earnest face, at the courage that had made him pick up a gun he barely knew how to use and stand against grown men with murder in their eyes. Whatever else happened, he couldn't let that courage go to waste. "We prepare," Caleb said. "They'll come back, probably tonight or tomorrow. They'll expect us to run or to fort up and wait, so we do something they don't expect." "What's that?" A smile touched Caleb's mouth, cold and without humor. "We make this ranch so expensive to take that Blackwell decides you're not worth the cost." Over the next hours, while winter light faded toward evening, Caleb transformed his ranch into a fortress. He showed Thomas how to position furniture for cover, how to create firing angles that would turn the house into a killing box for anyone who forced entry. He checked every window, every door, every approach that men on horseback might use. May worked alongside them, her fear channeled into action. She gathered water, stocked the root cellar with supplies, prepared bandages and medicine for wounds she hoped they wouldn't need. Lucy helped where she could, her small hands carrying ammunition, organizing supplies, creating order from chaos. By nightfall, the ranch looked the same from outside, but inside it had become something else entirely, something hard and ready and unforgiving. Caleb positioned himself by the main window where he had clear sightlines to all approaches. Thomas took the back room with the Spencer carbine, his hands steadier now, with purpose. May stayed with Lucy in the cellar, a pistol Caleb had given her resting in her lap like a sleeping snake. Then they waited. The night came down cold and absolute. Stars appeared in a sky so clear it looked brittle enough to shatter. Caleb watched the darkness, listening to the wind, to the small sounds of the house settling, to his own heartbeat steady in his chest. He thought about Matthew, about the brother who'd believed in helping people even when it cost everything. He thought about the years he'd spent running from that belief, from the pain of caring, from the risk of loss. He thought about how silence had seemed like safety, but had really just been surrender. Somewhere in the darkness, Thomas coughed quietly. Lucy whispered something to her mother. The old house creaked in the cold, and Caleb realized that for the first time in 7 years, he wasn't alone. He was responsible. He was needed. He was, despite everything, exactly where he was supposed to be. The attack came 2 hours before dawn. Caleb heard them before he saw them. The muffled sound of horses being walked quietly, the soft creak of leather, the whisper of men who thought they were being silent. He counted at least 8, maybe 10, more than he'd expected, but not more than he'd prepared for. "They're here," he called softly. Behind him, the house came alive with quiet purpose. Thomas moving to his position, May checking her gun, Lucy staying silent in the cellar like they'd practiced. Everyone in place, everyone ready, everyone committed to the fight ahead. The riders stopped just outside rifle range, dark shapes against darker night. Caleb recognized the big man from before, sitting his horse in the center, his voice carrying clear in the frozen air. "Last chance, friend. Send out the woman and children and you live. Fight and everyone dies." Caleb's answer was a rifle shot that kicked up snow between the horses' hooves and sent them dancing sideways. The message was clear enough without words. What followed was chaos compressed into moments that felt like hours. The riders split, attacking from multiple sides, and Caleb moved through the house like a ghost, firing from one window, then another, never staying still, never giving them a clear target. Thomas held the back approach, his shots less accurate but determined enough to keep the riders honest. May's pistol barked once when someone tried the root cellar door, and the cursing retreat told Caleb her aim had been truer than expected. They fought like cornered animals, desperate and fierce, making every approach costly, every advance paid for in blood. Men fell or retreated, horses screamed and bolted, and the winter night filled with gunfire and violence that shattered the prairie's ancient peace. But there were too many. Caleb knew it even as he fought, knew that eventually numbers would tell, that ammunition would run low, that exhaustion would slow his hands and cloud his judgment. He was bleeding from a new wound on his arm, his ribs screaming with every movement, and Thomas was down to his last rounds when the big man's voice cut through the chaos. "Enough!" The firing stopped. Caleb crouched below the window, breathing hard, and risked a look outside. The big man sat his horse alone now, the others fallen back or fallen entirely, his face twisted with rage and grudging respect. "You've got spine. I'll grant you that. But you're finished. Out of ammunition soon, if not already. Wounded, tired. Send them out now and I'll let you live. You have my word." "Your word's worth shit," Caleb called back. "Maybe. But it's all you're getting. Clock's ticking, friend. What's it gonna be?" Caleb looked at Thomas, at the boy's white face and trembling hands, looked at the cellar door behind which May and Lucy waited, looked at the home he'd built in isolation and the family that had accidentally filled it. Everything he'd tried not to care about, everyone he'd tried not to love, all of it balanced on the edge of a decision that seemed to have only one answer. He could surrender them, save himself, return to the silence he'd claimed to want, or he could stand. "Mr. Rowe?" Thomas's voice was small. "It's okay. We can go." "You don't have to eat." "Yes," Caleb interrupted. "I do." He stood then, fully visible in the window, rifle raised despite the exhaustion singing through every muscle. "You want them. Come take them. But you'll have to go through me first, and I promise you, I won't die easy." The big man's laugh was genuine this time, almost admiring. "No, I don't expect you will." He raised his hand and Caleb braced for the final assault, the rush that would end one way or another. Then a new voice cut through the night, hard and carrying absolute authority. "Lower your weapons, all of you, now!" Riders appeared from the darkness, at least a dozen of them, and even in the dim starlight, Caleb could see the badges glinting on their chests. The big man cursed, and his remaining men looked around like trapped animals seeking escape that didn't exist. At the front of the new arrivals sat a gray-haired man with a weathered face and eyes that had seen too much to be impressed by much. He guided his horse forward, his hand resting easy on his sidearm, his gaze taking in the carnage with the practiced assessment of someone who'd seen plenty. "Marshal Henshaw," the big man said, his voice tight. "This is a private matter." "Murder's not private, Cole. Neither is attacking a man's home." The marshal looked at Caleb. "You Rowe?" "I am. Got a telegraph yesterday. Judge in Helena has questions about Cyrus Blackwell's business practices, something about coercion, theft, illegal appropriation of estate funds." Henshaw's eyes moved to May's face in the cellar doorway. "You May Sullivan?" "Yes, sir." "Judge wants to talk to you. Seems Blackwell's dead wife had a lawyer who took exception to how her final wishes were handled. Made some noise in the right places. The kind of noise that gets federal attention." Hope flared in May's eyes, fragile and bright. "He can't touch us?" "Not legally. And after tonight," Henshaw gestured at the bodies in the snow, the wounded men, the evidence of assault. "Not any way at all. Cole, you and your boys are under arrest. Drop your weapons." The big man's hand twitched toward his gun, and Henshaw's moved faster, the click of a hammer being cocked loud in the sudden silence. "Don't," the marshal said quietly. "I'd hate to shoot you, but I won't lose sleep over it." The standoff held for 3 heartbeats. Then Cole's shoulders sagged and his gun hit the snow. His men followed suit, defeated not by Caleb's desperate defense, but by the law they'd thought they could ignore. As the marshal's deputies moved in to collect the prisoners, Henshaw dismounted and approached the house. Caleb met him on the porch, swaying slightly from exhaustion and blood loss, but standing. "You look like hell, Rowe. Feel worse." "I bet." Henshaw glanced at Thomas, who'd emerged with the carbine still in his hands. "This your boy?" "My nephew." Something in Henshaw's expression softened. "He fight alongside you." "Better than I deserved." The marshal nodded slowly, then extended his hand. Caleb took it, feeling the firm grip of a man who respected courage when he saw it. "You did good tonight. Stood when most men would have folded. That counts for something." Henshaw released his hand. "We'll need statements, probably tomorrow. For now, get that looked at." He nodded at Caleb's wounds. "And get some rest. This is over." As the marshal and his prisoners rode away into the darkness, Caleb stood on his porch and felt something he hadn't experienced in 7 years. Peace. Not the silence of isolation, not the numbness of deliberate disconnection, but actual peace, the kind that comes from standing for something that matters, from protecting people you've finally admitted you love. May appeared beside him, Lucy in her arms, Thomas pressed close to her side. They looked at the darkness where danger had been, then at each other, and no words seemed adequate for what had just happened. "Is it really over?" Lucy asked in a small voice. Caleb looked down at her, at this child who'd drawn him pictures and trusted him with her nightmares. "Yeah, sweetheart, it's really over. Can we stay?" The question hung in the cold air. Caleb felt May's eyes on him, felt Thomas holding his breath, felt the weight of a decision that would determine not just their future, but his own. He thought about silence and solitude, about the safety of distance and the cost of caring, about all the reasons he'd built walls and all the ways this broken family had torn them down. "Yeah," he heard himself say. "You can stay." Thomas's smile could have lit the whole prairie. Lucy buried her face in her mother's shoulder with a sound that might have been laughter or tears. And May looked at him with eyes that held gratitude and something deeper, something that would take time to name but felt like coming home. They went inside together as dawn began to pale the eastern sky, and the door closed behind them not on isolation, but on family, on belonging, on the life Caleb Rowe had spent 7 years running from and one desperate night fighting to keep. The sun rose on a ranch transformed by violence into something that looked like a battlefield. Blood stained the snow in dark patches that would take weeks to melt away. Spent cartridges littered the ground like brass seeds that would never grow. The barn door hung crooked where a bullet had shattered the top hinge, and the fence rail Thomas had crouched behind was splintered into jagged pieces that caught the early light like broken teeth. Caleb stood in the doorway, nursing coffee gone cold again, his body a catalog of pain that would get worse before it got better. The wound across his ribs pulled with every breath. His jaw was swollen where Cole's fist had connected, painting half his face in shades of purple and yellow. His knuckles were split, his shoulder wrenched, and somewhere around the 3rd hour of not sleeping he'd stopped counting the smaller hurts that added up to one clear message. He was getting too old for this kind of fight. Behind him, the house was finally quiet. May had gotten the children to sleep near dawn, their exhaustion winning over fear, and she'd followed soon after, curled on the floor beside Lucy's bed like she couldn't bear to be separated even by a few feet. Caleb had checked on them once, seen 3 faces slack with the particular vulnerability of deep sleep, and backed away before the tenderness in his chest could become something he'd have to name. The sound of horses brought his hand to his rifle before his mind fully registered the movement. His body knew the drill now, knew that riders meant danger, and it took a conscious effort to relax when he saw Marshal Henshaw approaching alone, his gray horse picking its way carefully through the debris of last night's violence. "Figured you'd be up," Henshaw said by way of greeting, dismounting with the stiffness of a man who'd spent too many hours in the saddle. "Mind if I water my horse?" "Trough's by the barn." Henshaw led his mount over and stood watching it drink while Caleb descended the porch steps, moving carefully, each movement a negotiation with damaged tissue. The marshal's eyes tracked the injuries with professional assessment. "You see a doctor about those ribs?" "Don't need a doctor to tell me they hurt. Need one to tell you if they're broken. Broken rib can puncture a lung if you're not careful." "I'll be careful." Henshaw smiled slightly, the expression of a man who'd heard that particular brand of stubborn pride before and knew better than to argue with it. "Cole and his boys are locked up in Helena. Federal marshals are handling it now, given the estate fraud angle. Blackwell himself is being brought in for questioning. He'll buy his way out." "Maybe. Probably." Henshaw shrugged. "But the questions will be asked in public, and public questions have a way of making private business uncomfortable. His operation's going to take a hit regardless of what the courts decide. And that woman in your house, she's safe now. Blackwell won't risk touching her with federal eyes on him." Caleb felt something unknot in his chest, a tension he hadn't fully acknowledged until it released. "You came all the way out here just to tell me that?" "Partly. Also came to see if you're as dumb as you looked last night, standing in that window daring a dozen armed men to take their best shot." Henshaw pulled a folded paper from his coat. "This is a deposition request. Judge wants May Sullivan's testimony about how Blackwell handled his wife's estate. Wants her in Helena by end of the month." "That's safe?" "I'll escort her personally. Bring her back myself when it's done." The marshal paused. "Unless she's planning to move on? Woman's got no legal obligation to stay in Montana once this is settled." The question behind the question was clear enough. Henshaw was asking about intent, about permanence, about whether the family that had fought together last night would stay together when the danger passed. Caleb took the paper without answering because he didn't have an answer, not one that made sense even to himself. "I'll tell her," he said instead. Henshaw nodded, swung back into his saddle with a grunt of effort. "One more thing. That boy of hers, Thomas. He handle a gun?" "Well enough. Better than well enough from what I saw. Kid's got steady hands and a cool head. Rare combination. The marshal gathered his reins. War taught me that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's acting right despite it. Your nephew's got that quality. You should be proud. He's not. Caleb stopped, the automatic denial dying on his tongue. Thomas had called him uncle in front of strangers, had stood beside him in battle, had risked his life without hesitation when it mattered. Whatever blood said, whatever technicalities existed, the boy had claimed him. Yeah, I am. Good. World needs more men willing to stand for something. Henshaw touched his hat brim in farewell. I'll be back in 2 weeks for Mrs. Sullivan. You folks take care until then. Caleb watched him ride away, the deposition request heavy in his hand, heavier with implications. May would have to leave, even if just temporarily, would have to face Blackwell's lawyers and judges and the machinery of law that ground slowly when it ground at all. And when it was done, when the testimony was given and the case resolved one way or another, she'd have choices. Places to go, lives to build, futures that didn't include a broken-down rancher on a Montana nowhere. The thought settled like lead in his gut. He was still standing there when Thomas emerged from the house, moving carefully, his face pale but composed. The boy had May's determination written in the set of his jaw, Matthew's eyes studying the world with careful attention to detail. Mama's still sleeping, Thomas said. Lucy, too. I didn't want to wake them. Good. They need rest. So do you. You look... The boy struggled for diplomatic phrasing. Tired. Feeling it. Caleb folded the paper and pocketed it. You sleep at all? Some. Kept dreaming about... Thomas gestured vaguely at the blood-stained snow. About last night. About what almost happened. Caleb understood. The first time you faced death, really faced it with weapons drawn and lives on the line, it left marks deeper than scars, changed the way you saw the world, the way you valued breath and heartbeat, and all the small moments between violence. That's normal. Dreams will fade eventually. Do they? Thomas looked at him directly. Uncle Matthew said you were in the war, said you saw things that stayed with you. Did they fade? The question was too honest for deflection. Caleb thought about battles 2 decades gone, about faces he'd never forget and names he'd tried desperately to remember. Some did, some didn't. But you learn to live with them. Learn they're part of who you are, not all of who you are. Thomas nodded slowly, processing this. I was scared last night. So scared I thought I might throw up or run or just freeze. But then I saw them coming for you and I couldn't let them. Does that make sense? More than you know. Mama says what I did was brave. I don't feel brave. I feel like I got lucky. Caleb put a hand on the boy's shoulder, feeling the tension there. The aftermath of adrenaline and fear wound tight through young muscles. Brave and lucky aren't opposites, Thomas. Sometimes they're the same thing. You acted when it mattered. That's what counts. I could have gotten you killed. If I'd missed, if they'd shot you while you were worried about me. But you didn't miss. And I'm not dead. And wasting time on what might have happened is just borrowing trouble from futures that don't exist. Caleb squeezed gently, then released. You did good, kid. Better than good. And The word stuck in his throat, unfamiliar from disuse. I'm grateful. For what you did. For who you are. Thomas's eyes went bright with tears he refused to let fall, and Caleb recognized that particular battle too. The fight to stay composed when emotion threatened to crack you open. The boy swallowed hard, nodded once, and changed the subject with obvious effort. What do we do now? About the ranch, I mean. There's damage, the barn door, the fence, bullet holes in the siding, and the bodies. His voice wavered. There were bodies. Are they still? Marshall's men took them during the night, wounded and dead both. It's just cleanup now. Caleb surveyed the work ahead with the practiced eye of someone who'd rebuilt before. Fence needs mending, barn needs fixing, house needs patching. All of it needs doing before the next storm hits. I can help. I know you can. They worked through the morning in companionable silence, Thomas following Caleb's lead, learning through observation and careful instruction. The boy had good hands for this kind of work, patient and precise. and he listened to direction without needing it repeated. By the time May and Lucy emerged near noon, the fence was passable and they'd started on the barn door. May stood on the porch taking in the evidence of their labor, the small improvements to chaos, and something in her expression shifted. She'd pinned her hair back, severe and practical, put on one of the few dresses she owned that wasn't worn to threads, and there was a determination in the way she held herself that suggested decisions made during whatever sleep she'd managed. "There's stew," she called, "and biscuits if anyone's hungry." They ate on the porch despite the cold because none of them wanted to be confined indoors just yet. Lucy sat close to Caleb, her small body pressed against his side like she was still confirming his physical presence. May fed them all with quiet efficiency, and it wasn't until the food was gone and coffee poured that she finally spoke what was clearly on her mind. "Marshal Henshaw came by this morning?" "Yeah, brought a deposition request. Judge wants your testimony in Helena." "When?" "End of the month. Henshaw will escort you there and back." May's hands tightened on her cup. "Just me? Or all of us?" The question hung heavy. Thomas looked between them, reading the subtext, understanding that this was about more than a trip to town. Lucy played with a biscuit crumb, oblivious to the tension, humming some song only she could hear. "Paper just mentions you, Sam," Caleb said carefully. "But I expect you'll want the children with you. Safer that way." "Safer." May repeated the word like it tasted bitter. "We put you in danger, Caleb. Nearly got you killed defending people you barely know. And now we're supposed to just leave? Go testify and then what? Come back like nothing happened? You didn't put me in danger. I made that choice. A choice you wouldn't have needed to make if we'd never knocked on your door." "Maybe." Caleb set down his cup. "But you did knock. And I let you in. And what happened after? That's on Blackwell and his thugs, not you." Thomas stood abruptly, his chair scraping. "I need to check the horses." He left before anyone could respond, and Lucy followed him without question, her small hand finding his automatically. The door closed behind them, leaving Caleb and May alone with all the words that had been accumulating weight since dawn. May spoke first, her voice low and fierce. "I won't let you throw your life away for us. Little late for that. Don't joke about this. You could have died last night. You could still die if Blackwell sends more men, if the law doesn't hold, if any of 100 things go wrong. You've already given us more than we had any right to ask for. You don't owe us anything else." Caleb looked at her, really looked, and saw the guilt eating at her, the fear that she'd traded one kind of danger for another. "What are you saying, May?" "I'm saying when we go to Helena, maybe we shouldn't come back. Maybe we take what's left of that money, find somewhere new to start, somewhere that won't paint a target on anyone who helps us. You think running will change anything? I think it might keep you alive." "And what about Thomas and Lucy? What kind of life is running? Always looking over your shoulder, never putting down roots, never trusting anyone long enough to call them family?" Caleb leaned forward. "That's not living. That's just surviving. And you deserve better. They deserve better. What we deserve and what we can have aren't the same thing. Maybe not, but I'm willing to fight for the difference." May's eyes filled with tears she wouldn't let fall, the same stubborn pride her son had inherited. "Why? Why would you fight for us? We're nothing to you. Strangers who brought trouble to your door. You're Matthew's family. That makes you mine. Matthew's dead." "I know. But his son's alive, his daughter's alive, you're alive, and maybe—" Caleb struggled for words that didn't come easy, feelings that had calcified from 7 years of deliberate neglect. "Maybe I'm tired of being alone. Maybe having people here, having noise and mess and life in this house again, maybe that's worth fighting for. Even if it costs you everything? I don't have everything to lose, just this ranch and the silence I've been using like armor, and last night taught me something." He met her eyes directly. "The silence doesn't protect you. It just makes you alone when the bullets start flying." May laughed wetly, wiping at her eyes with rough gestures. "You're a fool, Caleb Rowe. Probably. A stubborn, reckless fool who doesn't know when to quit. Sounds about right. Matthew said the same thing about you once. Said you were too damn stubborn to know when you were beat, and that's what made you dangerous. He say it like it was a compliment? He said it like he missed you. May's voice went soft. He never stopped missing you, you know. Even at the end, when he was talking about what to do if he didn't make it out of that mine, your name came up. He said if anything happened, I should find you, should tell you. She stopped, swallowed hard. Should tell you he understood why you left, and that he forgave you for it. The words hit like fists, driving breath from lungs already struggling around damaged ribs. Caleb turned away, staring out at the prairie where nothing moved, where wind had scoured the snow smooth and perfect. Forgiveness. As if Matthew had something to forgive, as if Caleb's abandonment of their partnership had been anything but cowardice dressed up as principle. I don't deserve forgiveness. Maybe not, but he gave it anyway. That's who he was. May moved closer, her presence warm at his shoulder. And I think he'd want you to forgive yourself too, to let go of whatever happened between you and accept that people are complicated, that we make mistakes, that love doesn't require perfection. I left him. He let you go. There's a difference. She touched his arm lightly. He made his choices, Caleb, started lending money he didn't have, helping people who couldn't pay him back. You told him it was killing the ranch, and he kept doing it anyway. That wasn't your fault. I could have stayed, could have tried harder to make him see reason. You could have. And then what? Spent years resenting him for dragging you down? Hated him for choosing others over your partnership? May shook her head. Sometimes leaving is the kindest thing you can do. Sometimes it's the only honest choice. Caleb thought about that, about all the years he'd carried guilt like penance, all the ways he'd punished himself for walking away. And slowly, painfully, he began to wonder if maybe Matthew had understood better than he did, had seen that their partnership was poisoned by fundamental disagreement and had let Caleb go rather than force him to watch everything crumble. He really forgave me? He really did. Said you were the best man he knew, even if you didn't believe it yourself. May smiled sadly. He was right about that, too. Before Caleb could respond, Lucy's scream split the air. Both of them were moving instantly, boots hitting porch boards in unison as they ran toward the barn where the children had gone. Thomas appeared in the doorway, his face white, something small and dark clutched in his hands. "There's a dog," he said, his voice shaking. "In the back stall. It's hurt bad." Caleb pushed past him into the barn's dim interior, following the sound of whimpering to the far corner where his old war dog lay in a nest of bloody straw. The animal had taken a bullet during the fight, Caleb realized with sickening clarity. Had been hit and dragged itself here to die in private the way wounded things often did. The dog's eyes found him, recognition flickering in their depths along with pain and something that looked like apology. "Sorry for failing you. Sorry for being hurt. Sorry for needing help when you needed protection." "Jesus," Caleb breathed, dropping to his knees beside the animal. The wound was in the shoulder, deep, bleeding slowly. Not immediately fatal, but bad enough that infection would kill if the bullet stayed in. "How long has he been here?" "Don't know. We just found him." Thomas crouched on the dog's other side, his hands hovering uselessly. "Can you help him?" Caleb assessed with the clinical detachment necessary for this kind of work. The bullet needed to come out. The wound needed cleaning and stitching. The dog needed warmth and rest and careful nursing. All things that would require time and effort and resources he hadn't budgeted for another living creature. But the dog had stood watch over this ranch for 5 years, had warned him about threats, had kept coyotes from the chickens, had been company in the particular way animals could be when humans proved inadequate. Loyalty deserved loyalty in return. "May, I need hot water and clean cloth." "Thomas, there's a bottle of whiskey in the kitchen cabinet. Bring it and the sewing kit." "Lucy," he looked at the girl's frightened face. "I need you to talk to him. Keep him calm while I work. Can you do that?" Lucy nodded and immediately began stroking the dog's head, whispering soft nonsense words that seemed to ease the animal's trembling. The others scattered to their tasks, and Caleb began the delicate work of extracting a bullet from living flesh while the dog whined and Lucy sang fragments of lullabies, and Thomas held the animal's legs steady with white-knuckled determination. It took an hour. By the end, Caleb's hands were steady, but his shirt was soaked with sweat despite the cold, and the dog lay quiet and still except for the labored rise and fall of its breathing. The bullet sat in a dish of bloody water, a misshapen piece of lead that had nearly ended another life in the chaos of defending this place. "Will he live?" Lucy asked, her voice small. "If infection doesn't set in. If he's strong enough." Caleb stroked the dog's ears gently. "He's a fighter, though. Survived worse than this in his time." Thomas helped him move the dog onto clean blankets near the house's fireplace, where warmth and supervision could give him the best chance. May brought broth that they coaxed down the animal's throat in small amounts, and Lucy appointed herself primary nurse, refusing to leave his side except when absolutely necessary. As evening fell and the dog slept restlessly, Caleb found himself watching his house fill with care and attention focused on saving one battered animal. Thomas checked the dog's breathing every few minutes. Lucy adjusted blankets with careful hands. May prepared poultices from herbs Caleb didn't know he had, her movements sure and practiced. They worked together without discussion, without assigned roles, just natural cooperation that came from shared purpose. And Caleb realized this was what family looked like. Not blood or obligation or formal ties, but people choosing to care about the same things, to work toward the same goals, to invest in each other's well-being without keeping score. "He's going to make it," May said softly, coming to stand beside him. "They all are. The dog, the children, you. All of us." "You sound certain." "I am, because we're not alone anymore, and that makes all the difference." She was right. Caleb could feel it in the warmth of the house, in the sound of children's voices, in the weight of responsibility that somehow felt lighter when shared. The silence he'd built his life around was gone, shattered by gunfire and rebuilt into something better, something that sounded like home. That night, long after the children had fallen asleep curled around the dog, May and Caleb sat at the kitchen table with the deposition request between them. Outside, the wind had picked up again, carrying the promise of more snow, more cold, more winter to survive. "I'll go to Helena," May said finally. "Give my testimony. Tell them everything about Blackwell and his wife and the money. But I'll come back, Caleb. If you'll have us, we'll come back." "You're sure? Helena's a city. More opportunities, more strangers, more uncertainty, more running." She cut him off. "This place, this ranch, it's the first time in years I've felt like we could stop. Like we could breathe. I won't give that up without a fight. Might be more fights coming. Blackwell's got reach even from behind bars. Let them come. We'll face them together." May reached across the table, her hand covering his. "That's what family does, isn't it? Stands together when things get hard." Caleb looked at her hand on his, at the calluses that matched his own, at the strength in those fingers that had held children safe through impossible odds. He thought about Matthew and forgiveness, about silence and isolation, about all the years he'd spent alone and all the days that stretched ahead filled with noise and mess and life. "Yeah," he said quietly, turning his hand to grip hers. "That's what family does." Outside, the wind howled and the snow began to fall, but inside the house was warm and full and alive with the sound of breathing, dog and children and woman and man. All of them healing, all of them fighting, all of them choosing to stay when running would have been easier, choosing each other when the world offered nothing but cold and dark and distance, choosing family. The 2 weeks before Helena passed, in a rhythm of work and healing that transformed the ranch from battlefield back into home. The dog recovered slowly, his shoulders stiff but functional, and Lucy's devotion to his care created a bond that made the animal shadow her everywhere, despite his limp. Thomas threw himself into ranch work with an intensity that spoke of something deeper than simple helpfulness. He was claiming this place, learning its rhythms, making himself indispensable in ways that went beyond labor. Caleb watched the boy absorb knowledge like drought-starved earth taking rain. How to read the sky for weather 3 days out. How to spot a lame horse before the limp showed. How to judge hay quality by smell and feel. Thomas asked questions that revealed a mind capable of connecting disparate facts into coherent understanding, and Caleb found himself teaching not just tasks but principles, Not just how, but why. They were mending fence on the north pasture when Thomas finally asked the question that had clearly been building for days. What was he like? Uncle Matthew, when you were partners? Caleb drove another staple into wood, buying time to organize thoughts about a man he'd spent 7 years trying not to remember. Generous to a fault. Never met a hard luck story he didn't want to fix. Could talk a wolf into vegetarianism if he set his mind to it. Mama says you two fought about money. We did. He kept lending it to folks who couldn't pay back. Kept taking in strays, people and animals both. The ranch couldn't support his charity and our living both. Thomas worked quietly for a moment, stretching wire with the careful tension Caleb had taught him. Was he wrong to help people? The question cut deeper than the boy probably intended. Caleb set down his tools and looked at his nephew directly. No, he wasn't wrong, but he wasn't right either. There's a difference between helping and enabling, between generosity and foolishness. Matthew never learned where that line was. You think what he did was foolish? I think he had a good heart in a world that doesn't always reward good hearts. I think he saw suffering and couldn't walk past it. And I think... Caleb paused, choosing words carefully. I think he was a better man than me, even if his choices weren't always smart ones. But you left because of those choices. I left because I couldn't watch him destroy something we'd built together, couldn't stand by while he gave away our future $1 at a time. Caleb picked up the wire cutters. That make me the smart one or the coward? I'm still not sure. Thomas considered this with the seriousness he brought to everything. Mama says sometimes the bravest thing is staying. Sometimes it's leaving. She says you can't judge without knowing the whole story. Your mama's a wise woman. She is, but she's scared too. About Helena, about testifying, about what happens after. The boy's hand stilled on the fence wire. She's scared we'll have to leave, that even if we come back, something will happen that makes staying impossible. Caleb heard the fear beneath the words, the question Thomas was really asking. Will you let us stay? Will you keep us? Will you choose us the way Matthew chose strangers? Your mama tell you what the deposition's about? Some. That she has to talk to a judge about Mr. Blackwell and the money his wife left her, that if she tells the truth, he might go to jail. Thomas met Caleb's eyes. She's afraid he'll find a way to hurt us anyway. That men like him always do. Men like him often do, Caleb agreed. But not always. And fear of what might happen isn't reason enough to stop doing what's right. Is that why you fought for us? Because it was right? The question was simple, but the answer was complex, layered with motivations Caleb himself didn't fully understand. He told himself he was honoring Matthew's memory, told himself it was about principle, about protecting people under his roof. But watching Thomas work beside him, seeing Lucy's drawings accumulate on every flat surface, hearing May's voice fill the silence he'd built so carefully, he knew it was more than duty or honor or obligation. I fought for you because I wanted to, Caleb said finally. Because somewhere in the past few weeks, you stopped being strangers and became, he struggled for the word, became mine, to protect, to teach, to stand with when things get hard. Thomas's eyes went bright with emotion he was clearly fighting to contain. We're yours? If you want to be. I want to be. More than anything. The boy's voice cracked slightly. I want this to be home. Want you to be family, not just Uncle Matthew's brother, but... He stopped, the enormity of what he was asking suddenly seeming too large. But what? But someone who chooses us, not because you have to, but because you want to. Caleb set down his tools and put both hands on Thomas's shoulders, feeling the tension there, the desperate hope that a 13-year-old shouldn't have to carry. I choose you. All of you, your sister, your mama, you. Whatever happens in Helena, whatever the courts decide about Blackwell, you have a home here as long as you want it. You mean that? I don't say things I don't mean. Thomas broke then, the careful composure crumbling as he stepped into Caleb's embrace and clung there with the desperate strength of someone who'd been holding himself together too long. Caleb held him, one hand on the boy's head, and felt something fundamental shift in his chest. This was his nephew, his family, his responsibility and privilege both. When Thomas finally pulled back, scrubbing at his face with rough gestures, His smile was watery but genuine. Thank you for choosing us, for being, he gestured helplessly, for being you. Being me's not much of a prize. It is to us. They finished the fence in silence that felt comfortable now rather than heavy, and when they returned to the house for supper, May took one look at their faces and knew something had shifted. She caught Caleb's eye across the table, the question clear in her expression, and he nodded slightly. Yes, I told him. Yes, we're keeping them. Yes, this is permanent. Her smile could have lit the whole prairie. The day before they were scheduled to leave for Helena, Caleb took May into town for supplies. The trip was ostensibly practical. They needed flour, coffee, ammunition, winter provisions that would see them through to spring. But as they rode the wagon down the rutted road, the real purpose became clear. You're worried about tomorrow, Caleb said. May pulled her shawl tighter against the wind. Is it that obvious? You've been quiet, checking on the children every 10 minutes. Last night I heard you up pacing at 2 in the morning. I can't help it. Every time I close my eyes, I see Blackwell's face. See him looking at me across that courtroom, knowing he could destroy us with a word if the judge believes him over me. The evidence is on your side. His wife's will, the lawyer's testimony, the documented threats. Evidence doesn't always matter. Not when you're facing a man who owns half the territory. May's hands twisted in her lap. What if I say the wrong thing? What if I freeze? What if you trust yourself? Caleb interrupted gently. You've survived 3 years alone with 2 children. You walked 3 days through winter to find safety. You faced armed men and didn't break. You're stronger than you think, May. I don't feel strong. I feel terrified. Strength and terror aren't opposites. You can be both. He glanced at her. Matthew used to say that courage wasn't the absence of fear. It was acting right despite it. You've been doing that since the day you knocked on my door. May was quiet for a long moment, watching the landscape roll past in shades of white and gray. He really said that? About courage? All the time. Usually right before he did something reckless that proved his point. A small smile touched her mouth. He was reckless, wasn't he? But in the best way. Like he couldn't help but care about people. That's one word for it. What's another? Infuriating, wonderful, impossible to stay angry at even when he deserved it. Caleb felt the old grief stir, gentler now than it had been. He'd be proud of you, you know, of how you've raised Thomas and Lucy, of how you've fought to keep them safe. You think? I know. He pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the general store. And I'm proud of you too, for what it's worth. May turned to look at him fully, her eyes searching his face for something she seemed to find. It's worth everything, she said softly. More than you know. Inside the store, Caleb watched May move through her shopping with practiced efficiency, counting coins carefully, choosing necessities over luxuries, making every dollar stretch. The shopkeeper, a thin man named Patterson, who'd run the store for 20 years, tallied her purchases with sharp eyes that lingered too long on her face. You're the Sullivan woman, he said finally. It wasn't a question. May's shoulders tensed, but her voice stayed level. I am. Heard you're testifying against Cyrus Blackwell. That true? Yes, Patterson snorted. Good luck with that. Blackwell's got judges in his pocket from here to Helena. You think your word's going to matter against his money? I think the truth matters, May said quietly. Regardless of who's speaking it. Truth. The shopkeeper's laugh was bitter. Truth is whatever men with power say it is, ma'am. You're wasting your time and risking your neck for nothing. Caleb stepped forward, his presence filling the space in a way that made Patterson step back instinctively. The lady's purchases. Total them up. I wasn't trying to say total them up. Patterson complied quickly, his hands fumbling with the ledger. When May tried to pay, Caleb pushed her coins back and laid down his own. Consider it an investment, he said when she started to protest. In truth. Outside, May was quiet until they'd loaded the wagon and started back toward the ranch. Then she spoke without looking at him. Thank you for that, for standing with me even when people think I'm fighting a losing battle. It's It's not a losing battle. You don't know that. No, but I know you, and I know you wouldn't be doing this if it wasn't worth doing. Caleb guided the horses around a rut in the road. Patterson's wrong about truth. It doesn't belong to powerful men. It just is. And speaking it, that takes courage money can't buy. Even if speaking it cost me everything? Especially then. May was silent for a long stretch, then reached over and placed her hand on his arm. The gesture was simple but intimate, a connection that acknowledged what had been building between them since that first desperate night. Trust, yes. Friendship, certainly. But something more, too, something neither of them had named yet, but both felt growing in the spaces between words. I'm glad I found you, she said softly. Glad Matthew told me about the good man in Montana who could fix anything if he set his mind to it. I'm not good at fixing things. You fixed us, gave us a home when we had none, gave Thomas a father figure he desperately needed, gave Lucy safety she'd never known, gave me... She paused, choosing words carefully. Gave me hope that maybe the world still contains decent men who do decent things. Caleb didn't know how to respond to that, so he simply covered her hand with his own, and they rode the rest of the way in silence that felt full rather than empty. When they reached the ranch, Thomas and Lucy came running out to help unload, and the moment passed into the ordinary chaos of family life. But that night, after the children were asleep and May was packing for the journey, Caleb found himself standing in the doorway of her room, watching her fold clothes with careful precision. About tomorrow, he started. I'm ready, or as ready as I'll ever be. That's not what I meant. He stepped inside, closing the door partly behind him. I meant about after, when you come back, assuming everything goes well with the testimony. May's hand stilled on a dress. What about it? This arrangement we have. You working for your keep, staying until things settle. That was temporary. A solution to an immediate problem. Caleb struggled with words that didn't come naturally. I'm saying it doesn't have to be temporary, if you want it permanent. You're asking us to stay? For good? I'm saying I want you to stay. Want Thomas to grow up here, learn the ranch, maybe run it someday if he wants. Want Lucy to feel safe enough to just be a kid. Want you to... He stopped. The next words too large, too vulnerable. Want you to have a home that's really yours. May turned to face him fully. Caleb, are you asking what I think you're asking? I don't know what I'm asking. I just know that this house feels right with you in it. That I've spent 7 years alone and I don't want to be alone anymore. That when you leave tomorrow, I'm going to worry every minute until you're back. He met her eyes. That's not just about Matthew's memory or doing right by his family. That's about you, about us, about what we could be if we let ourselves. The silence stretched between them, heavy with possibility and fear. May took a step closer, her expression unreadable. I care about you, Caleb, more than I probably should given how little time we've known each other, but I won't let you offer something out of obligation or guilt over your brother. This isn't about Matthew, isn't it? Even a little? Caleb considered lying, considered taking the easy path. But May deserved better. Maybe it started that way. Letting you stay, protecting you. Maybe that was about honoring his memory. But what I feel now when I look at you, that's not guilt. That's not obligation. He struggled for honesty. That's wanting. Wanting you here. Wanting to wake up to your voice. Wanting to build something real with someone who understands what it costs. May's eyes filled with tears. You mean that? I don't say things I don't mean. She laughed wetly. That's what you told Thomas. It was true then. It's true now. May crossed the remaining distance between them and placed both hands on his chest, right over his heart. Then when I come back from Helena, when this is done and we know we're safe, we'll talk about permanent, about what we could be, about building something together. That's a yes? That's a maybe that wants very badly to be a yes. She smiled through tears. Is that enough for now? Caleb covered her hands with his own. It's everything. They stood that way for a long moment, the future balanced on the edge of possibility, two damaged people finding in each other the courage to hope for something better. Then May pulled back gently, returning to her packing, and Caleb left her to it, but he carried the warmth of her hands on his chest long into the night. Marshal Henshaw arrived at dawn with 2 deputies and a closed wagon for the journey. May emerged dressed in her best, her hair pinned severe, her face composed despite the fear Caleb could see in her eyes. Thomas and Lucy clung to her, extracting promises about when she'd return, making her swear to be careful. 2 days there, 1 for testimony, 2 back, Henshaw said, loading May's small bag. You'll be home by week's end, Mrs. Sullivan. I give you my word. Can we come? Thomas asked suddenly. We could stay in Helena, wait for her. All come back together. Henshaw shook his head. Better you stay here. Court's no place for children, and the less connection Blackwell can draw between your mama and you, the safer you are. Caleb put a hand on Thomas's shoulder. He's right. You stay here. Help me with the ranch. Your mama needs to know you're safe so she can focus on what needs doing. Thomas nodded reluctantly, understanding the logic even if he didn't like it. Lucy buried her face in May's skirts one last time, then let Caleb pick her up so May could climb into the wagon. Their eyes met across the distance, 1,000 unsaid things passing between them. Be careful, Caleb said. Always am. And May, tell the truth. All of it. Don't hold back trying to protect anyone or soften edges. The judge needs to hear what really happened. I will. She settled into her seat, pulling her shawl tight. Take care of them? With my life. Henshaw snapped the reins and the wagon rolled forward, carrying May away toward Helena and justice and all the uncertainty that waited there. Caleb stood watching until the wagon disappeared, Lucy heavy in his arms, Thomas pressed against his side, the dog limping between them. She'll be okay, right? Lucy asked in a small voice. She'll be okay, Caleb said, praying he wasn't lying. Your mama's stronger than she looks. They returned to the house that felt too empty without May's presence, and Caleb threw himself into work to keep from thinking about all the ways testimony could go wrong. He taught Thomas advanced knots for securing loads. He helped Lucy practice her letters using the primer May had been working from. He repaired harness that didn't need fixing and organized the barn with obsessive precision. But at night, lying in bed listening to the wind, he thought about May facing Blackwell across a courtroom. Thought about her voice recounting threats and violence and theft dressed up as business. Thought about judges who might be bought and lawyers who'd twist truth into liability. Thought about losing her before he'd fully admitted he wanted to keep her. The days crawled past with agonizing slowness. Thomas grew quiet and withdrawn, his usual questions replaced by worried silence. Lucy stopped drawing, her charcoal sitting unused while she shadowed Caleb everywhere like she was afraid he might disappear too. Even the dog seemed to sense the household's anxiety, staying close to the children with protective vigilance. On the 4th day, Caleb caught Thomas staring down the road toward town. She'll be back soon, he said. What if she's not? What if something happened and the marshal couldn't protect her? What if Blackwell, don't borrow trouble from futures that don't exist. Your mama's with a federal marshal and 2 armed deputies. She's as safe as anyone can be. But you're worried too. I can tell. Caleb couldn't deny it. I am, but worry doesn't change anything except make the waiting harder. So we work. We trust. We wait. That's all we can do? That's all anyone can do. On the 5th day, late in the afternoon when the sun was already thinking about setting, Lucy spotted the wagon first. She was at the window where she'd been stationed most of the day, and her shriek of joy brought both Caleb and Thomas running. She's back! Mama's back! They rushed outside to meet the wagon, and Caleb's heart lurched when he saw May's face. She looked exhausted, wrung out, older than when she'd left. But she was smiling. And when she climbed down from the wagon and opened her arms, both children crashed into her with enough force to nearly knock her over. Easy, she laughed, tears streaming. I'm here. I'm home. I'm fine. Henshaw dismounted with a satisfied expression. Judge ruled in her favor. Blackwell's estate assets are frozen pending full investigation. The money Mrs. Sullivan received was deemed legitimate bequest, and all claims against her are dismissed. Blackwell? Caleb asked. Arrested on 6 counts of fraud, 3 of coercion, and 1 of conspiracy to commit assault. He'll be locked up for a long time. The marshal tipped his hat. Your lady here was magnificent. Testified for 3 hours straight without breaking, answered every question with clarity and courage. Judge was impressed. Hell, I was impressed. May blushed. I just told the truth. You did more than that. You stood up to a man who's terrorized this territory for a decade and didn't flinch. That takes spine. Henshaw gathered his reins. You folks have a good life. You've earned it. As the marshal rode away, Caleb finally allowed himself to breathe fully. May was home. The children were safe. Blackwell was caged. The nightmare that had driven them to his door was finally over. Come inside, he said. You must be exhausted. That night they gathered around the table, and May told them everything. The courtroom packed with spectators. Blackwell's lawyers trying to paint her as a thief, an opportunist. The judge's stern questions that had tested her resolve. And finally, the moment when the gavel came down and justice, improbable and precious, was served. I kept thinking about what you said, May told Caleb. About truth just being truth, regardless of who speaks it. Every time I got scared, I remembered that. Remembered you believed in me even when I didn't believe in myself. Lucy had fallen asleep in her mother's lap, and Thomas was nodding off against the table. Caleb stood to carry them to bed, but May caught his hand. Wait. There's something else, something I need to say while I have the courage. He sat back down, suddenly nervous. What is it? May took a deep breath. You asked me before I left about making this permanent, about staying, about building something together. I remember. My answer is yes. Not maybe, not someday. Yes, I want to stay. Want the children to grow up here. She met his eyes directly. Want to build a life with you, Caleb Rowe. If you'll have us. If you meant what you said. Caleb felt something enormous swell in his chest, too big for his ribs to contain. I meant every word. Then we stay. We're yours, if you're ours. I'm yours, he said simply. Have been since the night you wouldn't leave my porch. Maybe before that. Maybe since Matthew first told me about a woman strong enough to walk 3 days through winter for the safety of her children. May's smile was brilliant even through tears. Then it settled. We're family. Really, truly family. Thomas stirred, barely awake. We get to stay forever? Forever, May confirmed. Good, the boy mumbled, already drifting back to sleep. Was worried I'd have to leave before I learned everything. Caleb carried both children to bed while May prepared tea. Neither of them would drink. When he returned, she was standing at the window, looking out at darkness that no longer held threat, just the ordinary mystery of night on the prairie. Thank you, she said without turning, for giving us this, for being the man Matthew believed you were. Caleb came to stand beside her, their reflections visible in the dark glass. Two people who'd found each other through accident and necessity and stayed through choice. Two people building family from fragments and faith. I should thank you, he said, for knocking on my door, for refusing to leave, for showing me that silence isn't safety, it's just lonely. May leaned against him, and his arm came around her shoulders naturally, like they'd been doing this for years instead of weeks. Outside, the wind blew cold, but inside the house was warm and full and alive with the sound of breathing, with the promise of tomorrow, with the reality of home. Winter deepened over the weeks that followed, transforming the ranch into a world of white silence, broken only by the sounds of life being actively lived. The changes came gradually, so subtle at first that Caleb didn't notice them accumulating until he looked back and realized how completely his existence had been transformed. Thomas no longer asked permission before taking on tasks. He simply did them, moving through the ranch with the confidence of someone who belonged, who understood that this land was partly his to care for. The boy had grown taller in the months since that desperate November night, his shoulders broadening with work, his hands developing the calluses that marked a rancher. More than physical changes, though, something had shifted in his eyes. The wariness had faded, replaced by the kind of peace that came from knowing your place in the world was secure. Lucy bloomed like prairie flowers after rain. She talked more now, her voice filling the house with questions and observations and the particular brand of logic that only children possessed. Her drawings covered every wall, evolving from simple sketches into detailed portraits of ranch life, horses grazing, the dogs sleeping by the fire, Thomas working fence, May cooking, and Caleb himself captured in moments he hadn't known she was observing. In one particularly striking piece, she'd drawn all of them together on the porch, and underneath in careful letters she'd written, "My family." Caleb had found that drawing one morning and stood staring at it for longer than he cared to admit. Something warm and painful lodged in his chest. May had taken to ranch life with the same quiet competence she brought to everything. She'd expanded the garden plot, planning for spring planting that would provide vegetables through next winter. She'd reorganized the pantry, the barn, the entire household with efficiency that made daily life smoother without erasing the comfortable chaos of family. And she'd started leaving small touches throughout the house, wildflowers in jars when weather permitted, curtains she'd sewn from fabric ordered special from town, a quilt she worked on by lamplight that would eventually grace their marriage bed. Because they were getting married. The decision had come quietly one evening in February while they sat together after the children slept. No dramatic proposal, no grand gesture, just May looking up from her mending and saying, "We should make it official, for the children's sake if nothing else." "For the children's sake," Caleb had repeated, "and ours. Because I love you, Caleb Rowe. Because I want my name to be yours. Because sleeping in separate rooms when we both know where we'd rather be is getting ridiculous." He'd laughed at her bluntness, then sobered quickly. "I love you too, have for a while now. Just didn't know if saying it was rushing things. We survived a siege together. I think we're past worrying about rushing." So they were getting married. As soon as the circuit preacher made his spring rounds through the territory, they'd make it legal. In the meantime, they existed in the comfortable intimacy of people who'd already committed, who'd already chosen each other in every way that mattered. But first, there was something Caleb needed to do. On a bright March morning, when the snow was finally starting to think about melting, he saddled 2 horses and told Thomas to do the same. "Where are we going?" the boy asked. "There's a place I need to show you, about a day's ride south. We'll be back tomorrow evening." Thomas didn't question further, just prepared for the journey with the thoroughness Caleb had taught him. May packed them food and watched them leave with an expression that suggested she knew what this trip was about, even if Thomas didn't. They rode in comfortable silence through country beginning to wake from winter's grip. The air still bit cold, but there was a softness to it now, a promise of spring lurking beneath the chill. They made camp that night beside a creek running fast with snowmelt, and over a simple dinner of beans and hardtack, Thomas finally asked, "This is about Uncle Matthew, isn't it?" Caleb poked at the fire with a stick. "What makes you say that?" "Because you've been quiet all day. The kind of quiet you get when you're thinking about him, and we're heading toward Wyoming, where you two had your ranch. Smart kid. Too smart sometimes. You're right, there's something there I need to see. Something I should have dealt with years ago." "What is it?" "His grave. I never went back. After he died, after I got word, I just couldn't face it. Felt like going would make it real in a way I wasn't ready for." Caleb met his nephew's eyes across the fire. "But I'm ready now. And I want you there. Want you to know the man your father was. Not just the stories, but the place he's resting." Thomas was quiet for a long moment. "He wasn't really my father. Not by blood." "Blood doesn't make family, Thomas. Choice does. Matthew chose to raise you like you were his. That made him your father in every way that matters." "Did he ever talk about me? Before he died?" Caleb wished he could answer that question, wished he'd stayed in contact enough to know. "I don't know what Matthew said in those final years, but I know he loved you. Your mama told me how he was with you, how he taught you right from wrong, how he worked himself to exhaustion in those mines so you'd have food and shelter. That's what fathers do." "What about you?" Thomas asked quietly. "Are you going to be my father now?" The question hung in the cold air between them. Caleb thought about all the ways he'd failed at family, all the years he'd spent alone because connection felt too dangerous. Then he thought about this boy who'd stood beside him in battle, who learned with fierce dedication, who'd claimed him as uncle and clearly wanted to claim more. "I'd like to be," Caleb said carefully, "if you want that. Not trying to replace Matthew, just—" "I want it," Thomas interrupted. "I want you to be my pa. Want to carry your name if you and Mama get married. Want to learn everything you can teach me so someday I can run this ranch and make you proud." "You already make me proud." Thomas smiled, blinking hard against tears that caught firelight. Good. That's good. They reached the old ranch by mid-afternoon the next day. The land looked different than Caleb remembered, smaller somehow, the buildings more weathered. The house where he and Matthew had dreamed about building an empire stood empty, windows broken, porch sagging. The barn was still functional, but clearly unused. The whole place had the particular sadness of abandonment, of hope withered by time and circumstance. The cemetery was on a small rise overlooking the valley. Caleb had helped establish it years ago when a neighboring rancher's wife passed, never imagining he'd someday stand here looking at his brother's marker. The stone was simple, just Matthew's name and dates, no elaborate epitaph. Someone, probably the man who'd bought Matthew's half of the ranch, had kept the grass trimmed and the plot clear of weeds. Caleb dismounted and stood before the grave while Thomas hung back, giving him space for whatever this moment required. The silence stretched long enough that a hawk's cry echoed across the valley, sharp and lonely. "I'm sorry," Caleb finally said to the stone, to the brother beneath it, to the ghost of who they'd been together. "Sorry I left. Sorry I wasn't here when you needed me. Sorry I let pride and stubbornness come between us." The stone offered no absolution, no forgiveness, just the mute testimony of a life ended too soon. "I've got your family now. Your boy and your girl and May. I'm taking care of them the way you would have wanted, the way you asked May to make sure happened." Caleb's voice roughened. "Thomas is a good kid, smart, brave, kind. You did right by him, and I'm going to keep doing right by him. I promise you that." He felt Thomas move closer, the boy's presence solid at his shoulder. "I'm going to marry May," Caleb continued. "Going to give your children my name, my home, everything I have. Going to try to be the man you always believed I was, even when I didn't believe it myself." He paused, swallowing hard. "I'm going to be happy, Matthew, and I think you'd want that. Think you'd approve of how this worked out." Thomas spoke softly beside him. "I wish I remembered him better. I was so young when he died. Just fragments now. His laugh, the way he smelled like tobacco and leather, how he'd let me ride on his shoulders. He was a good man, too good for this world sometimes. He saw people suffering and couldn't walk past without helping, even when it cost him." Caleb put a hand on Thomas's shoulder. "You're like him in that way, got his heart. I want to be like both of you, Uncle Matthew's kindness and your strength. You're already better than both of us combined." They stood together in silence, 2 generations paying respects to the man who'd connected them, who'd sent them toward each other through May's desperate journey. Finally, Caleb knelt and placed his hand on the stone, cold and solid and real. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for being my brother, for believing in me even when I didn't deserve it, for sending them to me, for giving me a second chance at family." He stood, brushing dirt from his knees. "I won't waste it. I promise you that." As they rode away from the cemetery, Caleb felt something release in his chest. Some weight he'd been carrying for 7 years finally lifted. The past was settled. The guilt was acknowledged. And ahead lay the future, with all its messy, beautiful possibility. "Pa?" Thomas said as they crested a ridge. The title was tentative, testing. Caleb smiled. "Yeah, son. Thank you for bringing me here, for letting me say goodbye to him properly. Thank you for coming with me, for being brave enough to face it." They rode home through country beginning to show signs of spring, and when the ranch finally came into view the next evening, smoke curling from the chimney and lamplight warm in the windows, Caleb felt something profound settle in his bones. This was home. Not the land or the buildings, but the people inside. The family waiting. The life he'd stopped running from and started running toward. May met them at the door, Lucy beside her, both of them smiling with the particular relief of people who'd worried despite knowing worry accomplished nothing. Thomas dismounted and immediately began telling his sister about the journey, about the cemetery, about everything they'd seen. May stepped close to Caleb as he unsaddled the horses. "How was it?" "Hard, good, necessary." He looked at her in the fading light. "I told him about us, about the wedding, about how I'm going to spend the rest of my life making sure his family is taken care of. He'd be happy about that. I think so too. Caleb kissed her forehead gently. I'm ready now, for all of it. Marriage, family, the whole messy, beautiful disaster of loving people and being loved back. Good, because the preacher sent word he'll be through in 2 weeks, so we're getting married whether you're ready or not. 2 weeks? Is that a problem? Caleb looked at the house, at the children laughing together, at the woman who'd walked through winter to find him and stayed to love him. No, no problem at all. The wedding happened on a Tuesday in late March with the whole territory seemingly in attendance. Word had spread about the rancher who'd stood against Blackwell's men, about the widow who'd faced down Montana's most notorious criminal in court, about the family forged in violence and sealed in love. People came from 50 miles in all directions, bringing food and gifts and the kind of genuine joy that frontier communities reserved for celebrations that actually mattered. May wore a dress she'd sewn herself from fabric she'd been hoarding since Christmas, pale blue that brought out her eyes and fit her, like it had been designed by someone who understood both beauty and practicality. Lucy had woven wildflowers into her mother's hair, early spring blooms that shouldn't have survived the lingering cold but somehow had. Thomas stood beside Caleb, solemn in a new shirt, ready to witness his mother marry the man who'd become his father in every way except paperwork that would be corrected soon enough. The preacher was an old circuit rider named Walsh, who'd been marrying and burying Montana residents for 30 years. He'd seen every kind of union, desperate, convenient, passionate, political, and he had a gift for reading which ones would last. When he looked at Caleb and May, his weathered face broke into a smile. Well now, he said loud enough for the gathered crowd to hear. Here's a pair that looks like they mean it. May laughed, her hand tight in Caleb's. We mean it. Good. Because marriage out here isn't for the faint of heart. It's work and compromise and showing up day after day when it'd be easier to quit. You two ready for that? We've been doing it for months, Caleb said, just making it official now. Walsh nodded approvingly and began the ceremony. The words were traditional, time-tested, familiar to everyone present, but when he got to the vows, to the promises that would bind them legally and spiritually, Caleb felt the weight of them settle over his shoulders like a blanket he'd been seeking his whole life. Do you, Caleb Rowe, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death do you part? Caleb looked at May, at the woman who'd refused to leave his porch, who'd stood beside him in battle, who'd chosen him despite all his sharp edges and closed doors. I do. And do you, May Sullivan, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish till death do you part? May's eyes were bright with tears that matched Caleb's own. I do. Then by the power vested in me by the territory of Montana and the grace of the Almighty, I pronounce you husband and wife. Son, you can kiss your bride. Caleb did, and the crowd erupted in cheers and applause. Thomas whooped. Lucy clapped so hard her hands had to hurt. And somewhere in the noise and joy, Caleb heard an echo of Matthew's laugh, approving and warm and finally at peace. The celebration lasted well into the evening. People brought out fiddles and guitars, and dancing commenced in the barn they'd cleared for the occasion. Food appeared in quantities that suggested every household in the county had contributed, tables groaning under the weight of roasted meats and fresh bread and pies made from preserved fruits. Marshal Henshaw showed up with a bottle of whiskey that he presented to Caleb with solemn ceremony. To the man who stood when standing wasn't smart. May your marriage be as solid as your spine. Patterson, the shopkeeper who'd doubted May's chances in court, arrived with an embarrassed expression and a gift of fine coffee. Was wrong about you, Mrs. Rowe. About truth mattering. Wanted to say I'm sorry. May accepted the apology with grace, and Patterson left looking lighter for having delivered it. As the evening wore on and the dancing grew more spirited, Caleb found himself standing at the edge of the celebration watching his new family. May was dancing with Lucy, both of them laughing at some private joke. Thomas was attempting to teach the dog a trick, while a cluster of younger children watched in fascination. The whole scene was chaotic and loud and so full of life it made his chest ache. Quite a change from 7 months ago, a voice said beside him. Caleb turned to find an old neighbor, a rancher named Hutchins, who'd known him and Matthew in the Wyoming days. That it is. I remember when you first came up here, looked like a man running from something, didn't figure you for the marrying type. Neither did I. What changed? Caleb thought about desperate knocks on cold November nights, about children who drew pictures of safety, about a woman who saw the good in him when he'd forgotten it existed. Everything, he said simply. Everything changed. Hutchins nodded understanding. Well, you picked a good one. That wife of yours has steel in her spine and kindness in her heart. Rare combination. Don't I know it? As the celebration wound down and guests began the long journeys home, Caleb and May stood on the porch waving farewell. Thomas and Lucy had fallen asleep hours ago, carried to bed by helpful neighbors. The dog dozed at their feet. The spring night was cold but carried the promise of warmth coming, of life returning, of seasons turning the way they always did. Happy? May asked, leaning against Caleb's shoulder. More than I have any right to be. You have every right. You've earned this, Caleb, earned happiness and family and all of it. He pulled her closer, breathing in the scent of wildflowers in her hair, feeling the solid warmth of her against his side. We earned it, together. They stood that way until the last wagon disappeared and silence reclaimed the prairie. Then May took his hand and led him inside, to the home they'd built from necessity and choice, to the life waiting to be lived. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm that felt both brand new and ancient as time. Caleb woke each morning to May beside him, her presence in his bed still miraculous despite its regularity. They worked the ranch together, dividing labor in ways that played to their strengths. Thomas was formally adopted, the papers signed and sealed, making him Thomas Rowe-in-law as well as Hart. Lucy started lessons with a teacher who rode out from town twice a week, her quick mind soaking up reading and arithmetic with fierce determination. Spring came in earnest, transforming the prairie from white to green seemingly overnight. They planted May's expanded garden, the whole family working together to turn soil and sow seeds that would feed them through next winter. Caleb bought 3 new horses, good breeding stock that would improve his herd. Thomas proved to have a natural gift with animals, the horses responding to his quiet patience in ways that made Caleb's chest swell with pride. One evening in late May, with summer approaching fast and the days growing long with light, they gathered on the porch after supper. The dog sprawled at Lucy's feet. Thomas was reading aloud from a book about Western exploration, his voice confident now where it had once been hesitant. May sat beside Caleb on the bench he'd built years ago for a solitude that no longer called to him. Pa? Thomas looked up from his book. The teacher said there's going to be a territorial fair in Helena this summer. Competitions for livestock and crops and all kinds of things. She said we should enter. Caleb considered. Long trip for a maybe prize. But we could show off what we've built here. Show people that our ranch is one of the best in Montana. The boy's enthusiasm was infectious. And Lucy's never seen a city. Neither have I, really. It would be educational. May laughed. Educational. Is that what we're calling adventures now? Mama, please, can we go? She looked at Caleb, the question clear in her eyes. He thought about the ranch he'd built alone, the isolation he'd maintained so carefully. Then he thought about his family, about giving his children experiences that would expand their world, about standing proud beside his wife, while strangers judged their livestock and found it excellent. We'll go, he decided. Enter our best horses, some of May's preserves. Make a trip of it. Stay a few days, see the sights, come home when we're ready. Thomas whooped and Lucy clapped, already planning what they'd wear and see and do. May squeezed Caleb's hand in silent thanks for understanding that family meant sometimes leaving the comfortable familiar for the uncertain, exciting. That summer they did go to Helena. They entered competitions and won some, lost others, and gained respect regardless. They stayed in a hotel that amazed the children with its luxuries. They ate restaurant meals and attended a theater performance and walked streets so different from their prairie home it might as well have been another world. But when the week ended and they loaded up the wagon for home, all of them were ready. The city had been wonderful, but it wasn't where they belonged. The ranch was. They returned to find everything as they'd left it, the land patient and waiting. That night, after the children were asleep and the unpacking was done, Caleb stood in the doorway looking out at stars so bright they hurt. May came to stand beside him, slipping her hand into his. Glad to be home? More than words can say. Me too. Helena was exciting, but this... She gestured at the darkness, at the prairie stretching endlessly, at the small circle of lamplight that marked their home. This is ours. This is where we belong. Caleb pulled her close, breathing in the scent of home and family and all the things he'd stopped running from. Thank you, he said quietly. For what? For knocking on my door, for refusing to leave, for seeing something in me worth saving. May turned to face him fully, her hands coming up to frame his face. You saved yourself, Caleb. I just gave you a reason to try. We saved each other then. Yeah, I think we did. They stood together in the doorway of their home, watching the night and the land and the future stretching bright before them. Inside, the children slept safe and loved. The dog dozed by the cooling stove. The house held the warmth of family and the promise of tomorrow. 7 months ago, Caleb had stood in this same doorway and heard a knock that changed everything. Had opened the door to 3 desperate people and tried to close it on obligation. Had failed at closing it and succeeded at something infinitely more valuable. He'd found family, not the one he was born to, but the one he chose, the one that chose him back. And in the choosing, in the staying, in the daily work of loving imperfect people and being loved imperfectly in return, he'd found the life Matthew had always believed he deserved. The door that once stayed closed now remained open, not because someone asked, but because Caleb Rowe had finally learned that the silence he'd craved had never been safety at all. It had just been loneliness dressed up as choice. And love, messy, loud, demanding, beautiful love, was worth every moment of noise. The stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns. The wind carried the scent of sage and grass and home, and in the doorway of a ranch in Montana, a man stood with his wife and counted himself blessed beyond measure. Not because life was perfect, but because it was real. And real, he'd learned, was more than enough.